The climate crisis is on everybody's minds, and everybody's scrambling for solutions, as we've seen in the recent UN Climate Week in New York. What role can the circular economy play in that solving this important issue? We are going to explore this together with Per Klevnäs from Material Economics, who's an expert on the topic and who we've been doing some important work with recently. So stay tuned if you want to find out more.
We need to start making more conscious material choices.
Set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.
Hello there, I'm Joss with the MacArthur Foundation, live from the studio in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Per Klevnäs, who's coming straight from Stockholm and who is a partner with Material Economics, a consultancy that specializes in energy, climate, circular economy solutions. Hi Per, how's everything on your end?
Thank you.
Good, wonderful. So today we want to talk about circular economy and its role in fighting the climate crisis. So we've released together a paper in September looking at 5 specific sectors in the economy. But before we go into the details of that specific piece of work, I'd like to take a couple of steps back, because actually the logic and some of the analytical engines that were used for our report were, I would say, established in that important piece of work that you guys released in 2018. We were fortunate enough to be on the advisory board and the steering committee for that. And it's a really big effort. What I would like you to tell us today, to start off with, is how did that piece differ from a lot of other pieces of work that we've seen on the topic? What was the groundbreaking approach, and what type of categorizations of emissions did you have to do? And in a way, did that help the debate? Did that confuse the debate? What was the sort of birth of the project, and what did it bring to the conversation in your opinion?
Oh, thanks, Jos. No, I mean, when we set out to do that report, I guess you could describe it in a very sort of grandiose way as, what does a low carbon economy have to do with a circular economy? Or more prosaically, perhaps, how many megatons or gigatons of CO2 reduction sit in achieving a more circular economy? And in a way, you'd have thought that we've had a long discussion about recycling, about resource efficiency, about various of these topics, but somehow they've never really quite been put on the same page. And so we approached it with some humility, thinking, we will have to listen and see what's out there, and found that actually there was a really timely need for a sort of aggregation and synthesis exercise here. The context here from a climate perspective is that we have, of course, talked a lot about energy, low carbon energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. These are the mainstays of a energy transition. And this energy in terms of course propels transportation, heats buildings, it provides power, etc. And we have talked much less about materials. The materials here are steel, aluminium, cement, plastics and chemicals. And these are quite invisible in our everyday life. Plastics is more visible now, perhaps, than others, but nonetheless are ubiquitous to our societies. And a couple of points on that. One is that we have long looked at how we can use more energy more efficiently, and how can we get the same mobility, the same thermal comfort in buildings, the same power, but use less energy. But we never really asked the same questions of our materials. We've never really asked, okay, do we need to have 12 tons of steel each? Do we need to use 100 kilograms of plastics each? Or are there ways that we can reduce the production of new materials, but still have the same amount of economic well-being? That, of course, is exactly the same point that many of the circular economy concepts try to get at. But what we did in the report then is to collate those that have the most impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And what we found is that we could address something like, this was in a European context then, where we developed this, something like half of the emissions from the production of materials could be addressed by looking at the demand side, by looking how we use and reuse and recirculate materials, rather than just looking at, well, we also need to do that, but just looking at the production and the emissions that arise there.
And when you established that logic, did you feel that you had to, did you get some pushback? Did you feel that you had to do an extra effort when it came to pedagogy, because some of the discourse was so well established that, and it had been for about 20, 25 years. How was it received?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely, in that we are very used to thinking of emissions in terms of producing things, and then thinking in terms of now we need to reduce emissions from that production. So there's long been a debate about, can we have carbon capture, can we have new industrial processes? Whereas the use of materials, I mean, materials cross borders, they are not consumed where they are produced, they are, as I said, much of their use is invisible in everyday life, etc. So it took quite a lot of, what shall I call it, almost education in order to show that a lot of the emissions actually arise from our use in automotive sector, in the building sector, in packaging, and in other uses. And so that it challenges a bit the traditional way of accounting for emissions or having a conversation about emissions in the climate community and climate debates. That said, I think there was a lot of readiness, because there's on the other hand a big appreciation that these emissions is among the trickiest of them all to address. It's very difficult to cut the emissions from steel or from plastics production or from cement production. And when we found here that actually there's more that can be done that has been part of the debate so far, there was quite a lot of interest in that.
And interestingly, you talk about plastics and steel. I mean, intuitively, steel, you understand because of the need for super high temperature. Of course, it's energy intensive. You would be tempted to think that plastics is a much easier issue to solve. Is that correct, or is it counterintuitive?
No, I mean, I think it's not correct. Actually, I think plastics are at least as difficult, as it turns out. I mean, and if I take these three, they're difficult for different reasons. So it's true that high temperatures and energy intensity are a big deal and part of the story here. But another one is that we actually use the carbon today as part of the process chemistry. And when we produce steel, we have to get the iron out of the iron ore, and then to do that, we use carbon. And it's not so much a question of not just a question of energy then, or the energy use. And likewise, of course, when we make plastics, they're literally built out of carbon. So if you take the plastics that are produced every year, and you think of that in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent, it turns out just that carbon that sits in the product, which is today is new fossil carbon, is as big as aviation in emissions terms, right? And everyone knows we need to do something about flying. Everyone knows we have to do something about our fuels. It's much less sort of realized that fossil carbon that we use as materials is also a very big deal in emissions terms.
Yeah, which takes us straight to the argument that we're making in the climate paper that we released during Climate Week in New York together with you guys. And maybe if we can have the slide on screen that shows the split between energy and products in terms of the emissions. Maybe you can take us into more detail with regards of what sits where, because as you were saying, you challenge the way you look at these, and maybe there's a bit of recategorization of those figures as well. So traditionally, industry emissions might be embedded into the whole energy discussion as a whole, which is slightly misleading, because then you can't really pull them out and apply new strategies to them. So if we could have the slide on screen, then maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so one piece of this is, of course, land use and agriculture, which we highlighted in the report. I mean, I've talked mostly about materials now. And there, it's not so much about carbon as it is about other types of greenhouse gases. And they arise from our use of fertilizer, from livestock, from the balance of carbon between soils in the atmosphere, and land, different, as well as forests in the atmosphere. And so that's a big part of the fortify that we see there. And our food production system then is very greenhouse gas emissions intensive. But it's not so much a carbon budget and low carbon and all of that. It's a different type of logic. And the other half of the fortify there is industry. And when we talk about industry, there is of course energy use in industry as well. But even if you take that out and you put it back into the 55 and you talk about all the electricity used in industry, well, that's part of the energy part of the equation here. There are large emissions from the big parts of the emissions from industry are precisely those we have talked about. It's a story about steel, about cement, about chemicals, about embedded carbon. And then you can add to that, you can add aluminium and copper and some others. And many of these have, as I said, carbon released as an integral part of how we produce these materials, not for its energy, but as part of the chemistry. And so we have to do one of two things here. We can't, well, the first thing to note is that there are sort of workhorses of energy transition here to use renewable energy, to use energy efficiency. By all means, we should deploy them as much as we can, but they will not address the whole problem. And so the two things we can do, we can either create entirely new production processes, or we can capture the carbon. That's on the production side. That's been fairly well established and discussed. And the other thing we can do, as I said, is to reduce the amount of new materials that we need by recycling materials, by reusing products, by being more efficient with eliminating waste and being more efficient in our use. And I guess the story here, intuitively it makes sense. Why not get the most economic value and greenhouse gas emissions reductions out of it? But it then turns out that actually that changes the conversation quite a lot in terms of what is in a climate strategy. Well, this is all but invisible to date, and so we think it's really high time. We need we can't leave any stones unturned here. We need everything we can access in order to cut these very tricky emissions.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because that's a really important point going forward. But you raised the point of getting more use out of the product, increasing the utilization rate, which has an impact on and is driven by the business models that we use as well. At the moment,
sure.
Linearity drives throughput and volume sales. If we want to get to a model whereby companies sell the use of their equipment and the service and retain ownership, then the cost structure of the economy needs to be challenged as well. The incentives are not the same. The fiscal framework, to a certain extent, needs to change as well. And that's a conversation that needs to be had, because we can't think that simply because circular economy seems like a good idea, it's on a level playing field with the linear system. One has been hardwired for and by the economy as we know it, and the other one is a new idea. So how do we get that conversation as well and say, if you want to drive, and that may be a long shot, but if you want to drive the charge on the climate crisis, you are going to start selling the use of your products and keeping your products as material banks. There's a lot to unpack in that. The journey is pretty long. So what sort of pedagogy can be used? What's in it for business, and what can business do?
Yeah, it's a lot of questions there. I think you're perfectly right, and you can just contrast the production side of these sectors. You've got extremely optimized production processes that are now in most cases 70 to 100 years old, that really are amazing production systems in their own right. But of course, with continued use of virgin resources, and as this work highlights, and large greenhouse gas emissions as well. Whereas we are only at the beginning of exploring the much more numerous different types of ways of, as you said, of circular economy solutions. So there's a timing issue here, but it's also, as long as one simple answer is, of course, that as long as materials keep not paying the full way, there will always be an uphill struggle here. But there's also much more of an innovation journey, frankly. In this, I think, the easiest way I think of thinking about this is something like car sharing, a car sharing system. We can perhaps talk a bit about that, because in my head, there's a big debate. Is it a good thing? Is it not? It causes some social dislocation. It challenges existing ways of doing things, and so on. And what we want to bring to the table with this work is to say that, well, however that plays out, and we have to design it in the right way, and all the rest. One of the big benefits is that we can have we need much less materials in order to get the mobility that we need, and therefore we also have addressing quite a big pool of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. And so I think one is also just to take all of the different benefits and questions and put them on the table together, and then of course there's still the hard work of changing consumer behavior or in expectations, and of aligning incentives in regulations in big and small and of the big innovation here. But at the moment, we are not even clear that there's a huge prize at the end of it. And I guess greenhouse gases mitigation adds to all the other benefits of the circular economy.
So the logic for the mobility system is, I think, well established, and people intuitively get it. It might be a bit more difficult when it comes to the built environment, big, immovable things. But we were talking earlier about the question of cement, which is a fascinating one, and it's starting to creep up when it's question of lacking sand, for instance. We're seeing shortages of some basic things that people thought intuitively would never ever run out. And the CO2 impact and the negative impact of the production of cement is really beginning to become a visible issue. Can you zoom in on some figures with regards to cement and concrete use and what could be avoided?
Yeah, I mean, the total amount used is phenomenal, right? It's now, if memory serves, around 4 billion tons per year, and the emissions associated with it are something like 7% of then CO2 emissions, a bit less of total greenhouse gas emissions. And these are astounding numbers. If cement were a country, it would be, I don't know which one to compare it to, but it would be very, very large and very visible. And of course, construction is a sector which, in many ways, we recognize is quite difficult to get right. We have 5 regulations because otherwise we don't get buildings that perform well. In the energy space, it's long been established that it's very difficult for an end user to get the energy performance they need unless there's some sort of regulation in place. So that's all been regulated and established. But when we look at the materials use and the construction process and how we do it, many of these sort of the complications of that supply chain and the barriers and the failings that exist in it play out in massive materials use that could be changed, right? And so one example of this is that many of the buildings that are torn down are actually structurally sound, but you need to are being torn down in order because that part of town now has a different flavor. You need a different type of building in place, or renovation is very expensive because it wasn't built in to have a building that was flexible, that was modular, that could have a longer lifetime. And so 70% of the greenhouse gas footprint sits in the structure, but that structure is sound, but you still tear it down and build something new because it's cheaper with the way things are now set up. And the same thing leads to phenomenal overuse of materials. When you have a construction contract, you optimize for minimizing time and hitting deadlines and making sure labor forces are not idle and all the rest. We have a very rudimentary way of keeping inventories, and one of the results that in many buildings with steel frames, you actually use twice as much steel as needed, not just to keep the building up, but for the actual strength specification you wanted. And so you could use much, much less steel. But at the cost of some transaction cost, you need to digitize the process. You need to be more flexible in how you do it. And again, that's not where the contracts are, not where the innovation focus is, and where the value capture is for the industry. And finally, then, when we look at the actual fine basic materials we use here, we could substitute. We could use much more timber construction, which could drive reforestation, which could capture carbon instead of release carbon in the production. And also, when we use concrete as opposed to cement, we have standards which again were put in place for very good reasons to keep buildings from falling down, but which prescribe an amount of cement which in the concrete which could be reduced without compromising on actual structural integrity in any way. But again, that's not an innovation system that's there. It's not something that's being explored very much. And so when you start unpacking the materials used here, from over-specification to lifetimes to how materials are specified, you start seeing that we could in fact have just as much benefit from buildings, but we could use much, much less materials. And this matters because almost half of materials used and greenhouse gases sit from materials and industries sit in the construction value chain.
So what I take away from what you're saying is that actually a colossal part of the problem sits with design in the first place. It's
Absolutely.
about the way we conceive the products and the buildings and the infrastructure being overly generous, to put it mildly, with the material intensity. And that maybe hasn't caught up with technological innovations, and we're still pumping loads of more materials than needed, whereas in fact structural engineering could help reduce that, for instance, or maybe design for durability. You also said something which might have sounded counterintuitive to a lot of listeners, but you said use more timber and drive reforestation at the same time. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, no, and this is of course a debate. You know, we have if one sees the world's forests as such as they are, as a sort of an absolute and a limited, then the temptation from a climate perspective might be to just leave them alone, and you say, how can it possibly help the climate to ever cut down a tree? But if you open the space a little bit further, you see that there's lots of land that once was forest or that could be forest that isn't. And in order for that to be reforested, you need something to drive the value of that forest. And of course, as a construction material is one possible. You could also have other ways of doing it. But you could, in fact, see a scenario. You'd have to look at it carefully. And of course, you should never cut down forests with very high biodiversity values and so on. But you could, in fact, see reforestation being driven by demand for the economic value of the construction materials.
And that's the whole issue of changing the system so that we look at regenerating the right bits in order to get the feedstock, renewable feedstock that could last for a long time as well, and extract new value from it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you hit upon something important there. I mean, I've been trying to give a few examples from different value chains and how they could be, but very easy that this conversation fragments into lots of anecdotes or examples and everything. But the power of it, as you say, is when you start looking at the total system. As you say, if you start with the principle of design, then from that flows durability, it flows flexibility, there flows materials choice, and all these other things, which then cumulatively really add up to very large greenhouse gas emissions reductions.
And there's a question that just came in from our listeners. That's an interesting high-level one, and you can answer that very simply if you want, giving the example of the reaction you had in your interactions with businesses and politicians. Does breaking down the issue in terms of energy and products make it seem more manageable? So I'm not sure if the implication here is that it's only an illusion of being more manageable, or is actually because it's helping people get a grip on it.
No, I think it's critical that we do it, and here's why. Ultimately, what we can do in climate terms is a question of having the right market solutions and having the right governance technology in place, and having the right governance and institutions and incentives, right? And it's only once you've identified something as an important issue that all of these start coming into place. And so if you take energy efficiency, we have had energy efficiency institutions and policy and debate and investigations and lots of technology development for, since the oil crisis. That was when that really took off, and we've achieved tremendous amounts through that. But we don't have anything like it for the way we use materials in society. And climate is only, as I said, only one reason to think about this, but it is a big enough piece of the puzzle that it really deserves its own debate and to be recognized as a part of all climate strategies. But today, a lot of the relevant policies, some of them sit with industry ministries, some sit with waste management, others sit with, in particular bits to do with the built environment, etc. And it's all incredibly fragmented in institutional terms. So both for a sort of governance and policy making type of angle, and also from a business angle, it's only when you put together various pieces of puzzle that you can get a new business model to work. We really need to have the language and to identify that this is a big thing, not a small marginal thing.
So in a way, you could argue, as we do in the recommendation parts of our report, that any government or any business serious about having a climate strategy cannot afford not to include any circular economy strategy, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and certainly ones that do, and at different points for different countries, right? Any country such as that of the European Union, which is now thinking about net zero economy within a few decades, and foregoing this will make it tremendously much harder, right? As at a minimum, it may not be possible. And for countries that are rapidly trying to achieve lower emissions while also building out infrastructure, urbanizing, increasing materials use in various ways, the claims on just a challenge of building out steel supply and building out chemical supply and all the rest is also, this takes the edge of that tremendously, right? So whoever you are really in thinking about combining future well-being with low carbon emissions, circular economy really does have a place.
So you talk about the European Commission. So far, of course, we don't know much about what the exact plan is going to be. It hasn't taken office yet, but we've seen very strong signals coming out of the president-elect. And looking at the Green New Deal or New Green Deal for Europe, circular economy is a key part of this. And we should see a plan coming together within the first 100 days of that commission. What, in your mind, can we see happening? Is it just a bit more of the circular economy action plan and the package, or would you expect intuitively, of course, because we don't really know, would you expect something much more ambitious?
It's hard to guess, but I think that the tenor of the conversation is very different now. I mean, if you'd said a few years ago, will a climate or green action plan have circular economy in it, thinking about it from a climate point of view, the answer might well have been no. Now I think it's become clear that it needs to be there. And I think that said, I think that I have high expectations in terms of that realization sitting there, the intention being there, and if that's realistically what can play out in the first 100 days. But then I think there's quite a lot of hard work that needs to be done in really merging entirely new policy agendas into the climate debate, and that will have to play out over years, I guess. But if there's anything we are in the climate debate and to respect the climate change, it's short of time, and so the sooner that can start, the better. And then I'm as curious as anyone to see what concrete initiatives will come first here. We'll see, right?
Well, it seems like Vice President Timmermans has already started talking about taxation as one issue that can't be left off the table.
Yeah. I think that's right, and I think there's another part of it then, which is of course that industry. We talked about it mostly in terms of materials and what we use the products for. We talked about them in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but of course it's also very, very integral to the structure of the EU and what the economy and what with the coal and steel being at the very heart of it. And there's a big debate about the future of basic industry in Europe. And here I think actually, perhaps paradoxically to some, the circular economy, building on recycled resources and leveling the playing field with respect to others who don't have CO2 regulations, all of that will also strengthen the debate for making as efficient use as we can of materials and getting as much out of it as we can.
Which is very attractive for an economy that doesn't have a strong resource base and is dependent on imports and doesn't have a lot of space to deal with the waste. But what about big economies that do have resources, that do have space, and who on top of it don't really care about the climate crisis? How do we get to that sort of leader as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two answers here, I suppose. I mean, one is that some of these system changes just really make sense in their own right and are happening, and climate then becomes a reason to accelerate it and another reason that they become very beneficial. And I think that a much more intensive use of vehicles in a shared car system is an example of that. I think that's the direction this industry is going regardless. But of course we can do it well, or we can do it not well, and we can get maximum or not climate benefit out of it. So it always matters to have a climate lens, and just like circular economy has a lot to contribute to climate change, so do greenhouse gas mitigation reductions need to be part of when we think about the future circular systems that we want, perhaps regardless. And the same goes really for construction. If you look at productivity improvements in that value chain, they've been a bit abysmal in any economy really, and there are big opportunities for digitization and otherwise. And again, putting those things that can really reduce greenhouse gas emissions into that is part of a wider shift in the value chain and in the industry. So I think, of course, if you want to set climate aside, which for the time being, some big economies are doing, perhaps at least at a sort of central level, if not at a distributed level, then of course you go to a slightly different conclusion. But a lot of the changes we're talking about here, looking after your material stocks so that you become less dependent on imports, looking at more efficient mobility and construction systems, it makes sense anyway.
Yeah, which in a way is interesting, because you can have a isolationist position, be very protectionist, while at the same time not doing it at all for the reasons we're talking about. but still putting a dent in it, which in a way, I guess, let's take everything that comes in the right direction, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'll take another question now, and I suppose it applies to both the initial report that you guys put out and the one that we just released with you. What type of impacts do papers like these tend to have? Is there a cause for hope? And I would add, what sort of follow-up are you guys doing on this? Do you get a lot of requests for additional work? Are countries coming to you and saying, I want that same type of study, but for my national economy?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we're still here in the territory of a big idea shift, and I shall say that first of all, we shouldn't take the full credit for either of the report you showed there or the paper. A lot of people's good thinking and research over the years and all the rest have gone into it, and what we did here was to pull together the total picture, add some new pieces, but really building on a lot of work in everything from what the foundation has done to academics in industrial ecology to metallurgy to all sorts of areas, right? But the idea shift here is that we and others have been trying to affect is that these two agendas really belong together. That there's another, fortunately, just as the climate crisis is becoming ever more pressing, there's another lever to pull and to show how that can be done and what it consists of. And as I said, I think that if you talked about this 3 years ago, the tenor of the debate would have been very different. So I think it does matter to change ideas and to establish new ideas and to also establish just a vision of where do we want to get to. If you talk about the energy system today, people have some idea that it's about renewable energy, being more efficient with energy. We're going to have intermittent renewables, we need storage, we need smart grids, etc. If you ask, what does a material system look like in the future, you get answers that are much, much less. Sometimes you get no answer at all, and in other cases you get answers that are much less developed, and we need those. And so I think that that's the point of papers like this, is to establish a new area so that we can talk about it and identify it as a big thing. In terms of the actual response and impact, I think there's a lot of interest now. We've seen this just from our little angle here. We've seen it from a lot of the political leadership, both at the European Commission and at member state level. We tend to work mostly in Europe, with specific regions that are now looking into what this could mean for the particular materials flows they are working with and the structure of their economies. And also a lot of companies that are asking, okay, well, if I'm going to be a steel producer in the future, or if I'm making packaging in the future, how can I make a product that is good? That doesn't mean that when my customer or my customer's customers buy this, they don't have to buy a lot of bad baggage. And this agenda becomes very much part of it. There's very few companies now that would be comfortable saying that they will ignore climate in that. So I think we see a lot of demand for understanding, the next implementation step here and what's big and small and how should we approach it.
And of course, we're very soon going to be into COP25 period, happening in Madrid instead of Chile for political reasons in Chile. Do you have hopes that this discourse is starting to permeate? Are you looking for signs that it will be on the agenda? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think COP is what gets into COP and what ultimately, I mean, there's a lot happening at COP that is talking, discussing, etc. But ultimately, what we need to keep our eyes on is COP next year, and the first update to the NDCs, the climate commitments that countries are making under the Paris Agreement. And I'm torn there. They tend to focus still very much on renewable energy, to some extent energy efficiency. They tend to talk about the 55% rather than 45%. And we're running out of time for that. And so I think that we really need one more acceleration, and we need to start getting industry emissions and, for that matter, land use emissions much, much more into that debate. And so I think there's quite a lot of heavy lifting, if I'm honest, to really get it into the COP debate that really matters, which is how countries then say, yes, we will commit to reducing our emissions, and here's the full quiver of arrows we will fire at that problems, and to really get this established. So quite a lot of discussion, work, analysis that lies ahead there, I think.
And of course, it's always a question of getting the level of attractiveness of the idea right, and being able to communicate it in a very concise and tangible fashion. So if I were to ask you, what are the 3 biggest takeaways from what the circular economy adds to the climate debate, what would be yours? 3 snappy points.
The first is that we have a lot of economic upside and benefits still to designing products and systems so that we can recirculate materials. We've got a long way with metals, we have more to do, but certainly with plastics, there's a whole other way that we could have all the benefits of plastics without digging up new oil and gas in order to feed that system. And that has a big economic upside. It has benefits in terms of creating incentives to avoid ocean leakage, and it can make an awful lot of sense for the climate. So that's one big area to focus on. The other one I would say is that we can really, there are 2 major value chains where we really need to look and work, or maybe 3 then. One is construction, the other one is mobility, and especially the way we use cars in cities, and then it's packaging. And in all of these 3, we are wasting tremendous resources by underutilizing assets, and by generating a lot of other negative effects, again, from ocean leakage to plastics, to a lot of congestion, accidents, and air pollution from mobility. And so let's harness all of those three things together in order to get a better agenda. And then the final one is that, as other recent reports also, such as that from the Food and Land Use Coalition, have shown, there's a tremendous opportunity in pooling the many benefits from more rational land use and agricultural systems that work much better for both health, for people, and for the climate.
Thanks a lot, Per. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and working with you on these topics. We will keep, of course, our viewers updated, and people can go and download the resources. The report is on our website. The Material Economics Circular Economy, a Powerful Force for Climate Mitigation, is on their website, but we can actually find easy links to that. That's all for me for today, and I wish you a very pleasant week of DIF. Stay tuned. Thank you.
We need to start making more conscious material choices.
Set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.